This is me. I've been a professional writer for about 30 years, and I've worked for Marvel in DC and blah, 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 blah. Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated. I brought this book in particular, which I wrote, because Tarzan is a trademark character as well as a registered copyright. And there's a difference between those. Burroughs was a really smart guy, and he trademarked Tarzan very early on. You know that every so many years, trademarks and copyrights, they kind of seem to fade. But he managed to fix it to where, Tarzan's over 100 years old, and he's still owned by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Anyone can take, say, Tarzan of the Apes, the first book, and reprint it if they want, provided they reprint it exactly as he wrote it.
It's public domain.
Yeah, it's public domain. But Tarzan is not.
It takes 80 years to get it public domain.
As a character, Tarzan is not public domain.
It's
A lot of people
trademarked.
get confused with that.
I believe it's also service mark,
Yeah.
meaning no one else can take a Tarzan and put him with gorillas
Right.
outside, even if you have a new world built.
Yeah.
Service marks are easier to sue under, by the way.
And for a guy who did this back in the middle 1920s, that was pretty visionary, actually. It was a similar situation with Sherlock Holmes, which I've also written. Back when I was first doing it, there was some confusion as to whether Holmes was a public domain character or whether or not he was still owned by the Conan Doyle estate, and it was kind of a little bit of both. Some of the original Sherlock Holmes stories were public domain, and some weren't yet. Now they all are, to the best of my knowledge, anyway. My stories were original Holmes stories, and so that's one of the reasons why the publisher I was working with at the time was concerned to approach them and get them to license it, which they did. And so everything was fine. But I knew some other people who weren't quite so lucky, and they went into that, and they kind of went after them. But, it took me over 20 years to find out how much Conan Doyle's estate charged for a license for Sherlock Holmes. Anybody want to guess?
Relatively low.
25 bucks. That's all they asked. And I got to talk to his daughter, Conan Doyle's daughter, before she passed. And she was something else. And and I asked her about that. I said, that's a really low licensing fee. And she said, there's so much Sherlock Holmes material all over the world, we do just fine with that.
Nice.
Did he trademarked, the Conan Doyle, did he have trademarks?
I don't think he did.
Oh, by the way, I'm Maggie. Hi.
Yeah.
I'm Michelle. I'm in the art room. I've been on secret panels apparently that no one told me about. So
If you were in the art room, saw the big Godzilla, she painted that.
Ooh.
So hi. But yeah, did Conan Doyle do much trademarking?
He didn't, but that was at a time, of course, this is the Victorian age we're talking about.
They still had trademark laws.
They did, and somebody like Charles Dickens was real savvy about that. But I don't think Conan Doyle was. And besides, he didn't really think a whole lot of Sherlock Holmes. This was just something that he was actually quite baffled by Holmes. He didn't understand why people were so crazy about it. But he wrote them anyway because that's what really sold the best for him, and that bothered him too. But yeah, he was much more inclined to suggest to people his historical novels, which he wrote a number of them, which he researched for years before he wrote them. So, he was quite rightly very proud of those. But they're not books that people read today too much. I've read a couple of them.
Yeah, imagine being known for the work that you least like.
He considered Holmes so insignificant that he would actually put off his deadlines for the Strain magazine to the last minute and be at like a cocktail party or something, like at Oscar Wilde's, and write the story right there. Just write it out in longhand and turn it in. And that's why there are so many inconsistencies with Sherlock Holmes. And sometimes Dr. Watson's name is John, sometimes it's James, sometimes he was hurt in the arm, sometimes the leg, and so forth, because he didn't bother to look back on it. But the stories are brilliant, and Conan, he was a brilliant fellow himself. I asked his daughter I said, is it true that your dad hated Sherlock Holmes? Because that's what everybody seems to say. And she said, oh, that's ridiculous. She said, he didn't hate him. She said, he was Sherlock Holmes.
Mm-hmm.
she said, when I was a little girl, just watching him around the house, he's prowling around in a purple dressing gown, smoking a pipe. He was Sherlock Holmes. And he could do a lot of the things, she said, that Holmes can do. So that's kind of where that came from. But she said that he didn't hate Holmes, he just didn't get it. He didn't understand why people were so obsessed with Holmes. And he was the big deal. When Conan Doyle decided to kill him off, which everybody was shocked and appalled, his mother even almost disowned him because he killed off Sherlock Holmes. And the Strand magazine kept saying, please, do something, right? Come bring him back. And he's like, no. And it was about 12 years later, and I don't know exactly why he decided to, but he visited a friend of his in the Grimpen Mire, and he was so impressed with that part of the country. Bless you. He was so impressed with that part of the country that he saw a story in it, and that's where he wrote Hound of Baskervilles. But and of course the Strand magazine was like, oh, we've got Sherlock Holmes back. He said, no, this is a story that took place before he died. He's not back.
Yeah.
So
those later things, sometimes it felt like he was getting heavy into Victorian spiritualist movement.
yeah, he was.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
And that kind of morphed some of his later stuff.
It did. He felt that by the time, like the last, maybe the last 10 years of his life or so, he almost abandoned literature altogether and was just lecturing on spiritualism.
He wrote a few pamphlets
He did.
and stuff, which Houdini wrote counter pamphlets too.
yeah, that was quite a rivalry.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were good friends for a while.
Until.
And it's weird because again, when I was talking to his daughter one time, she was talking about Houdini visiting her house and so forth, and what a fellow he was. And she said, he used to put me on his lap and he would pull American quarters out of my ears from nowhere. He was just a wonderful fellow. But she said they didn't. After a while, Dad didn't even want to hear his name. The difference between the two apparently was Houdini wasn't saying that there wasn't such a thing as life after death. He was just saying that he didn't see any proof of it himself yet.
Well, yeah, he knew the tricks.
Yeah, because he would go to these things and see, I know exactly how they just did that, and be able to duplicate it, and that made Conan Doyle angry. Because it was very important to him. He'd lost a couple sons in the war, and he was determined that he was hearing from them, these things. A brilliant man, but obviously, I suppose he could be duped,
Grief will do things.
I wasn't there. I don't know if there were real ghosts or not.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but probably not.
And Houdini wanted that to be
He desperately wanted. I believe that the big straw that broke was Arthur Cohen's, Doyle's wife. She did seances and stuff.
She was a medium.
Yep, and she was, I'm going to channel your mother. She wrote 15 pages of messages to him, and he took it and just left without saying anything. And it's all in English. His mother only spoke Hungarian, and it extremely bothered him.
And his mother was calling him Harry, and that wasn't his real name. His name was Eric.
Yeah, he would never.
So
She
she
would
would
never
never
call
call
him
him Harry. So,
Yeah, we got actual subject matter that has nothing to do with the beginning.
yeah, it's fascinating stuff though. But with Tarzan, I'm just using him as an example because it's a character that everybody knows, and that a lot of people think everybody owns, but they don't. There's a company called a comic book company called Dynamite that was starting to publish Conan Doyle, Grace Burns stuff, and feeling like they could get away with it, and they did for a while, thinking, this is all just art, we can do whatever we want. And Princess of Mars, that's in public domain. We'll just make Deja Torres comics and stuff like that, original stuff. And no, it was not.
Not if you trademark it.
And the company went after them and sued them, and they finally came to an agreement to where they it's like almost forced them to license from them.
Which is $25?
Yeah, it's a lot more than that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and it's still a valuable license, Tarzan is. I think for The Legend of Tarzan, the most recent movie was made back in 2016. They actually flew my wife and I out to Hollywood to see the
Not
premiere
me,
of that.
not me. I'm not a white.
And it was an amazing thing to see out there. But it seems like I remember something like it was like $10 million. I think is what they got from Warner to just for the name Tarzan.
Wow.
Yeah, and then Disney even more so years before. So that's how they stay in business. Which is okay, you know.
Yes.
So for a character that some people feel has kind of went past his prime, or more or less, but that they feel it's old-fashioned and maybe a little old school. But I don't know. It
That's
depends
part
on
of
the
its
time.
charm.
Yeah, it is. I mean, this graphic novel here that I wrote is based on the original story, Tarzan Stories and Jungle Tales of Tarzan. And I stuck close to the stories. I didn't embellish anything or put in modern sensibilities or anything like that.
But that's an interesting
Reverse.
question. When we start getting into trademarked, not just trademark, but things that are still in the public domain but are rather old, we do run into an issue of modern sensibilities. How do you handle that? I guess I'm the track director now. How do you handle handle that? Because I'm at work at Pseudopod, and we run into a lot of issues, mostly with pulp error properties, where there's a lot of issues with modern sensibilities. And we do, because most of it's public domain, we do heavy editing. Because, okay, they're paid by the word, understand that, and it's people who paid by the word, I think they can be paid by the freaking letter half the time. And that's why they're always like this, he had a gambling debt, that's really why they were that thick, to pay off his gambling debts. So there's this editing, it's not just to chop off all the N-words and, you know, and stuff. It is literally so you can have a concise story that is readable, which is another way to make it more palatable to a modern audience, that they can actually read the story without 500 pages of exposition, which just sounds like they're giving you a pumpkin pie recipe. That happened. There's a pumpkin pie recipe in the middle of it, they'll get bored, count up. How do you handle that? Because it's cutting for a modern sensibility and for a modern audience to keep attention.
That could be tough. In a situation like Tarzan, it's even a little bit more complicated because Burroughs created something like, I think it was like 30 different guidelines that because during his lifetime, Tarzan took off in comic strips and things like that, and of course movie scripts, and he was very protective of it, and there were certain things that you just could not do with Tarzan, and if you did, you were in a lot of trouble. And so, like things like no like excessive profanity, no sexual activity, things like that. And a lot of people that I've talked to think the Burroughs novels are actually pretty sexy. So he pushed that a little bit himself for the time. Now these were written, well, Tarzan and the Apes were written in 1912, I think. Yeah. So it going back quite a ways. But he also was a kind of visionary writer in that, like all of his women characters, all of his main women characters are very strong women, and seem very modern by the standards that we look at today. And I know that he was unique in that at the time, and it bothered some people. You know, that you had this, like in the Palooza stories, when Deanne the Beautiful later on just sort of took over that series, and so people were like, well, no, what about the male hero kind of guys? He'd just be like, oh, this is the story. So
It's what he wanted to do with
Yeah.
it. All these women with their pockets handing out suffrage pamphlets. Take their pockets away.
So when you take into account that you're trying to add some kind of modern sensibility to it and be sensitive to certain things and also stick to the guidelines, it can be tricky.
Which is easier, Burroughs or author Conan Doyle? I have a tongue tie right
Which
now.
one's easier to write?
Yeah, which one is easier to translate to modern sensibility?
It's a really good question.
Yeah, I know, I'm asking good
I'm having
questions.
to really think about
I'm a
it.
director now.
Yeah. I've written both of them, and I've written 9 Sherlock Holmes books, and I've written about 3,000 Edgar Rice Burroughs comic strip episodes, so that's quite a bit. Those come pretty easy to me, honestly, because I guess I've gotten in the zone.
You know almost the formula of doing it.
And I don't really think about it much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I did when I was starting out. I've been doing it for over 10 years, so I don't know. Sherlock Holmes is very hard for me to write because it's so hard to write a character that's so much smarter than you are, you know, and he can be very intimidating. But I think there's less. I don't feel there's as much danger in offending somebody with Sherlock Holmes as I do in Tarzan.
Oh, okay.
I think, honestly.
Well, I know that some people have had the issue of, because it's in Africa, and it does open a lot of, especially with his father and stuff, old world colonization and kind of the horrible things that they did to Africa at that time, and it's kind of fed in. Do you avoid that altogether, or do you address it?
I address it in as much as Burroughs himself did, which in Burroughs' stories, particularly the Tarzan stories, but he wrote a lot more than just Tarzan. He wrote 24 Tarzan books, and I think in his lifetime he published 90 novels. So most of them are not Tarzan books. But generally in his Tarzan books, if there's an antagonist in his books, it's a white hunter or somebody it's a white person.
They have no right to be there.
Yeah,
A lot of them.
yeah, it's the outsider that's coming in. Burroughs, as far as the African natives and so forth, for the most part, presented them in a very positive light. Now there are some people who see a racial problem with some of them, but these were tribes that were like cannibals and just vicious tribes, that murderous tribes, which exist.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, sometimes people of color can be villains in real life, but today a lot of times people get upset by that.
Well, yeah.
And sometimes, justly so.
Rightfully, yeah.
But that's not what he was trying to do. He wasn't saying, trying to say that all African natives are horrible. And later on, there's one tribe in particular that Tarzan kind of adopts him. And
the Waziri?
Yeah, the Waziri. And they become a big thing in the rest of the books, and they're a very smart, capable, but very noble race that is so much better behaved than generally the European characters that come in, American characters.
It's also perspective.
Yeah.
You're getting this from, like, Burroughs' perspective, and you're living in his mind. It would be interesting to see how the portrayal of African people and societies are portrayed in that world from actual their point of view. It might be completely different. And there have been arguments of what they call white saviorism. You know, the English people are coming in and they know better and they can save them. And that has been an argument I've heard. I've read the original, and yeah, you can get into that bit. It was mostly well handled, but I still would love the opinion of someone who's from the perspective of that side of an African national, or can't just say national, it's a continent, the area. Who's like, does that take place closer to the Congo?
Yeah.
So a Congolese point of view. It's mostly their people that it's dealing with.
Yeah, Burroughs, I think, were he here to talk about it himself, I think he would be baffled by a lot of the problems people might have to his work, because he wasn't trying to make it a particular statement. I don't think he was just trying to entertain. And that's all he ever said he was.
He was a bit progressive for his time.
He was.
But even though you see these blind spots.
He was.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was progressive. He did have his blind spots, and he often was. He often put himself down when he would talk about himself to a degree. Like I remember there was a radio. There's not many radio interviews with him, but there's one in particular that I never forgot. Because the guy who was interviewing him finished up the interview by basically saying, my son and I the other night were going to the movies, and we were seeing that Tarzan's New York Adventure that's so popular right now, and we went and saw that, and we really had a good time with it, but but we read your books too, and the Tarzan and the movies, and your books are a very different guy. He said, how do you feel about that? And have you seen the movie? And Burroughs said, well, every time I go to see the movie, there's lines around the block, and I don't stand in line for anything but free hooch. And he said, as far as, he said, and as far as the other question, if 100 million people all over the world think Johnny Weissmuller is Tarzan, who the hell am I to say he's not? And that's just kind of how he saw it. He didn't take it real seriously. He saw it as a job like any other, and that's one of the things that made him so successful at it. He treated it as a job. And it still takes care of his family today. His grandkids, great-grandkids.
A little generational wealth.
He was the first American writer to successfully publish himself. Mark Twain had tried to do it, and it didn't work out for him, and lots of others did too. But he found out one day, this was when he was still in his early 30s, he found out one day from his publisher how much they were keeping of his sales. And the guy was like, that's just publishing. We got overhead, we got to pay this guy, we got, He's like, So he got together with a lawyer friend of his, and he said, I want you to, this is when he was still living in Chicago. He said, I want you to go out and find me a publishing house that's about to fold and buy it. And so that's going to be quite a penny. He's buying it. And so he said, keep everybody on staff, that's there, that knows what they're doing. And it's going to become Royce Burroughs Incorporated. We're going to publish our own books. And he started doing that. It was very successful for him. He never went any other way, except occasionally in other magazines and things he would have things show up. But he published his own books. He found he didn't have to deal with editors anymore, which is wonderful. And for him, he especially was edited very strongly in the beginning because he wasn't really a trained writer. He wrote things that he thought was interesting, and often they were trying to change him around, and that really bugged him out.
One of the only other writers I could think of that went and made their own publishing house and trademarked every booker that was in their world was L. Ron Hubbard, and that's a completely another story about why he did it.
It is, and kind of creepy in some places.
I won an L. Ron Hubbard award once, and it was okay.
Kind of like, okay, right.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly. Another thing too, to get off the Burroughs subject for a moment, is I've written also for some of DC's characters like Superman and Batman and so forth, and which are also trademarked, with really, really powerful lawyers now. Yeah. I mean, almost Disney level of lawyers.
Some of it is Disney.
Yeah, well, some of it is. They're very meticulous about how you handle your characters. Although it's hard to tell that by looking at some of the movies. Because some of the movies, DC's movies in particular, I almost don't recognize the characters by the way they behave. Superman hasn't behaved like Superman for a really long time, unless you count the animated TV series that Bruce Timm produced. And those are pretty much the real Superman.
They should give more credit to those, and I think most adults go into the movie theater for it, but it's not just for children. It actually is it.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. It's like you're getting the impression that these characters, these stories, when they were originally published, they were seen as more adult-like, and then they picked up the children's audience. Maybe that's why they started getting a bit protective about.
Yeah, the Batman was DC, Detective Comics. Batman was made to be a dark noir. Was hard-boiled because of how tragic he was and messed up. That was an adult story,
Yeah, the difference between the character, from the 30s, is Batman in the 30s tips the guy into the vat of chemicals.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, picked the wrong guy on this one, didn't you?
He was the hard-boiled detective.
Oh yeah, he was. He was. And then as it became more, really into the 50s, where comic books were for children, and there was a big, huge. Everybody got huffy about the content of comic books, It's funny, you can see it back in the old 50s Peanuts, you can see a reference to it when he's looking at comics that kill, hate, drag. This is like 53. This, that, were the, but it became more and more for children, and that's kind of where. But it was really, I got to see the era where it started changing.
Well, that TV show with Adam West, that really brought it to children.
Yeah.
Well, that was the 50s.
Yeah.
That was the 50s.
Yeah,
It was made in the 60s, but it was that 50s.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was that 50s. And but the characters and the writing for comic books became much more for adults. Split offs where you had we now call it a graphic novel. Back then it was the black and white magazine.
Yeah.
You read Conan, I was a Conan fan, so you read the one with a little comic seal on it. And then, that's the one that basically like the Hayes Commission.
Yeah, comics code.
Yeah, comics code, like men and women sleep in separate beds, preferably in separate bedrooms and things like that.
Sensibility of the time.
Yeah, and then there was the black and white novels, black and white books, which were just magazines.
Yeah,
Not
they were
subject
magazine
code.
size too, so you
Yeah.
can tell the difference.
There's
And-
murder in there.
Yeah, and, well, Conan, for example, so then they could take those and present the story the way Howard wrote them. Very different, but the question was, when you're dealing with trademark characters for someone who's, has established, this is the character, how far do you get to stray, and how dangerous is it to start straying away from the public perception of who that character is and what he's about, or she's about?
It could be that could be quite a tightrope. It depends on a lot of different things. I remember back when you brought up the Adam West show, and everybody perceived that as the Batman character. And that was a huge phenomenon. Batman was everywhere. A similar thing happened in 1989 with the Batman movie. That in a very different way Batman was perceived then. But I remember in the comics when they made that transition from the kind of goofy, lighthearted kind of adventure strip to when Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil started doing Batman.
That's going to say,
taking him back to his roots.
Neil Adams, when everything went from the light colors to everything was black, gray, navy blue.
And if you're Neil Adams, Denny deserves a lot of credit for this too. He was my editor for a while. He's a brilliant fellow. But Neil Adams' visual approach to Tarzan was so different and so realistic. He seemed real suddenly. He seemed like this guy could bleed, I guess, I think part of it was too that DC the Batman comics weren't selling very well anymore because the shows had gone off and everybody lost interest. And so they were just kind of like, yeah, try whatever you want. We might have to cancel them anyway. And it worked. Suddenly people start talking about it and the books sold out. That's really the deciding factor. If the books are going to be, if they're going to sell well and be successful, you can get away with a lot more. So.
I was going to say, because I guess it's like trying to hit a moving target. Because I remember when Archie Comics licensed the movie Josie and the Pussycats, they were really annoyed with the adult references. They made them reissue the DVD. And yet, years later, when they made the TV shows, those were much darker than what happened with management, but they definitely changed their mind.
In the live action that was on Netflix, that was set in that same world, that is not, Riverdale was not for children.
No,
I watched one episode, and I was like, this is statutory rape. Oh my God. And I didn't finish watching it because I really wasn't interested in a teen drama about statutory rape. Damn it, Archie. Yeah.
I know, it's like...
I remember Danny telling me concerning Batman, one of the ways that I think this answers your question somewhat, that they kind of got away with it is they decided that, because the early Batman was really violent. I remember one of the early comics where he had tracked this guy down that was supposedly a vampire, I think, or I thought he was, or something. And Batman ended up taking a pistol with silver bullets and emptying the guy's heart, And it just seems un-Batman-like, now, but that's what he did. And
Batman had guns.
Yeah, and so he did have guns at the early part. But those comics too, the first Batman comic was, 1939? And they were an offshoot of the Pulse. which were 37, you're right, I'm sorry. And they were an offshoot of the Pulps, which were pretty vicious in themselves, especially like The Shadow, which he was largely based off of originally. So Denny felt that, okay, we're going to do the stories, they're going to be violent crime stories, but Batman will never kill. So he still was sort of the pristine hero. Didn't mean he wouldn't break your back and put you in the hospital, but he would not kill.
Break your legs.
Yeah, that was his thing. And he made a good point of why he wouldn't, to me. He said, the reason I think that Batman doesn't kill is because when he was 9 years old and saw his parents gunned down in front of him, that traumatized him so much he doesn't want to ever see anyone die again. That was so traumatizing. And that's the way he saw Batman, and that's still kind of the one we have.
Yeah, they did reissue the original. I have someplace in the park, the original, like Detective Comics 17 or whatever. And Batman, the Batman is just one of a whole bunch of, and they're all like, they're all like, Philip Marlowe, who finally just, oh, screw this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he was just sort of a test character almost. They were just trying to see what was going, how it happened. Superman had already been really successful, and he wanted something else. And Batman kind of came with Bob Kane getting all the credit, which he didn't deserve.
There was some point where Batman became time plus money, he can do anything. And that wasn't how it was in the beginning at all. He was almost, it was hard-boiled, and it almost felt more loose of a cannon. He really was no better than who he was defending against.
Yeah, it was a combination, I felt like the early Batman to The Shadow and the Spider, which I think in some ways he actually has a lot, the early Batman has a lot more in common with the Spider than he did the Shadow. The Shadow stories are pretty much like detective noir stories. You don't really get to know the Shadow very well in the early stories. He's more of you're aware of him, but you don't really get to know him as a personality. Whereas the Spider is right out there, and he's just absolutely insane, and knows he's a monster. The only difference is he's on the apparent good side, and that's kind of what Batman was like too. He was scary at first. And I still think he works best being scary. I would like to see a movie someday, and I've liked a lot of them, but I'd like to see somebody make a Batman movie someday where he is just as elemental as he was supposed to be, and that almost gargoyle-like, and that people see him and they wet their pants. I mean, it's just awful.
Without being edgelordy, there's this line where sometimes interpretations, they want to do that, and it's just edgelordy, if you know what edgelords are. Edgelords is like, they're like, oh, whoa, I'm so dark and I'm tragic. It's like a teenager who's going through a phase. In college, you ran into these guys all the time where it's like, I'm so deep and I'm tragic in my hair. And we used to call them pizza cutter people. It's all edge, no point, And sometimes it slips into that with certain interpretations when you want almost that force of nature that's brooding. You don't want the, I need to see a therapist, really bad Batman.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I don't really read the comics anymore. I haven't for more than a decade.
It's getting a little edgy.
When I it's not my thing. If it's somebody else's thing, that's great. But for me, when I picked up a Batman comic one time and was looking through it, and this to me was just a bully in a bat suit. He was a guy that was really enjoying what he was doing, kicking this guy and everything. I don't see him that way. I think he's got to be better than we are. He's tough. Yeah, he's scary. He's also really smart, and he also has a soul. He also is sympathetic to the victims. He's not just out to hurt as many people as he possibly can.
There was sympathy for the villains. There was an understanding that he had a lot of similar background to them in tragedy. It's how he expressed his traumas differently. And he was always on the edge of being an Arkham himself.
Yeah. The villain Two-Face, for example, he always had a particular sympathy for because he saw himself in Two-Face in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I was just curious about, so when you do write and someone else's universe. What is the process? Do you propose a kind of short treatment, or how do you get involved with that process?
Yeah, the Batman story that I wrote, it's a chapter book for kids, and it's based on the Bruce Timm stuff from the Batman animated series, and so I was comfortable with that because I think that's probably actually the best interpretation of Batman ever, actually, even better than the comics, because they took the best stuff from the comics and kind of built it all in there. They had a certain list of villains I could use that they wanted me to use, and they kept pushing the Scarecrow at me because it was around the time that Batman Begins, and so they were pushing that at me. And I thought, okay, I'm not anything against the Scarecrow, that's fine. But the thing I had in mind, I wanted to also have Man-Bat, which nobody had seen for a while in the comics. And the editor I was talking to he was just completely confused why I wanted to write Man-Bat.
Well,
He's so stupid. What do you want to write Man-Bat for?
Most people think that, yeah.
Nobody would believe that.
What a jerk.
And all this, and I'm like, I think he's a cool character. He's the Wolfman with wings, basically. He doesn't really, his interpretation, well, Man-Bat's whole idea was he was trying to be a hero. He wanted to be like Batman, and so, but he transformed into this thing that can't control itself.
Literally
sometimes.
backwards.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a very tragic character. It's a lot of fun to write, stuff like that. And eventually they said, well, okay, fine. And then you come up with a little plot, and they yay or nay, or they'll change that or this, if there's that. They didn't give me a lot of trouble with it. I knew some people who did.
Which they could. There's a lot of throwaway villains in the history of Batman that you never see again.
And then when I wrote Superman book for them, it was the same thing. They were like, okay, this is a list of villains we want you to use, and the only one that I saw there that I wanted to use, somebody else was using it already, another writer. And so I said, what about the Parasite? And who? I said, it's a character Jim Shooter created back in the day. It's really cool Superman villain. What? Yeah. So he could basically absorb Superman's powers and use them against him. Well, okay, if that's what you want to do. The guy wasn't very enthusiastic. And then, so I thought of an idea for him, and I said, and what about Supergirl? Why would you want to write Supergirl?
She's neat.
And this is right before the TV series became a big thing. And this was the Supergirl, the one I wanted to write was the one from the Bruce Timm shows. The one that has the white t-shirt, and she's a kid, she's like 14. And it just worked in the story that I had in mind, the sort of big brother kind of idea behind Superman. And eventually, they just kind of say, write whatever you want. And so I did. But I remember when I sat down, this has never affected me before with anything I've ever written. I sat down to write that story, and when I first typed out the words "The Daily Planet," I had a panic attack. I remember I just typed it out, and I just kind of looked at it.
That's what you're doing.
And I stood up and walked around. I thought, I'm writing a damn Superman story.
That's what you're responsible for.
And my cats were looking at me weird and everything, and I was just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what else to say. And it was, I had to get over that.
It's responsibility.
It is.
With that big of a property.
It is. And I was thinking, because I did the Superman story first, I was thinking when I got to Batman and wrote Batcave, the same thing would happen, but it didn't.
Yeah.
So I was relieved about that.
You worked through that trauma.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
And that's just like, when a singer sings a song that's already been made famous, everyone's going to compare.
Yeah. Sing White Christmas. But yeah, it was it can be a bit of a, you could jump through hoops. It depends on who your editor is. Some editors are really cool, and they believe in letting you just, letting you go and do what you do. Of course, they have their own guidelines too, all these characters do, that you have to behave yourself with to a degree. You can't just do anything you want. Like you can't be Zack Snyder.
Yeah, don't be Zack Snyder.
Yeah, don't be Zack Snyder. Whose idea of his Superman, of his Batman movie was to have Batman raped in prison.
Oh, yeah.
So
Everything he does that kind of died in editing anyways. So.
But it depends. A lot of that depends on your editor. I've been really lucky in all the time I've been doing this to only have had two what I would consider bad editors. And both of them wanted to be writers.
That's the worst
Yeah,
editor.
you can tell.
They want to write what you did.
Most of my editors have been fine. I've had a couple that were great. I mean, that made you better, you know, than you thought you could be. Steve Gerber was one of them that created Howard the Duck and some things like a bunch of other things for Marvel. And he was just a great guy. And I learned more for like just story construction and character motivation from him than I ever did in any college class of creative writing ever took. In like 5 minutes, he just would kind of tell, well, you need to do this. Wow. You know, it's just amazing. It's amazing what a good editor can really do for you. And he was a great guy. He was patient too and generous with his ideas. You know, great fellow. He passed away some years ago. And I was always really happy though that I got to actually contact him before he did, tell him how much it meant to me that he managed to do that. And everybody that I knew that knew him just said the same things. Oh, Steve was just great. You know. But he was one of these guys who was primarily a writer, but he was an editor for Marvel for a while too, and he just had no ego when it came to it. He believed in the product, not the person involved. You know, we need to make this really good. You know, we don't need to worry about this. We need to make this good, and that's the way to do it. He said that's the best way that's going to shine back on us. And so,
I was wondering, what property do you wish that you could write in? It's existing. That isn't in public domain, and if it came around.
I got to do most of them. I did. One of my dream jobs was Popeye. I finally got to write an actual licensed Popeye comic about some years ago. Mars Attacks Popeye.
Wow.
That wasn't that idea wasn't mine, but the story was.
They threw it at you and said,
Yeah.
"You get money if you
Yeah.
figure this out."
They came to me and they said, we understand you like Popeye, and we have a license now with Mars Attacks, and we want to put them together. And I said, okay. Well, he said, we're going to do this to all of our comics, because they were doing a Kiss comic too, the rock band, and so it was going to be Mars Attacks Kiss, and it just went down the line.
Oh my God.
And I said, and I right away I snapped it up, and the guy said, are you sure? Because everybody else we've asked about this, they laugh at me and hung up. So you've asked other people before, apparently. But yeah, so I did that, and that was great. I've written Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Lee Falk's Phantom, I've written him. I wrote a radio play for Doc Savage, so that was cool. Read all those books when I was a kid. I don't know, of the characters that, like, say Marvel and DC have, which is what most people think of.
Yeah.
It would be something weird for Marvel. I would want something like Werewolf by Night or Tales of the Zombie, something like that nobody thinks about. And for DC, the one that I can think of I always wanted to do was the Spectre.
That'd be good.
They've tried to bring him back, but it's like it's a
It's
a short term. He's like a one-trick pony.
Yeah.
That's what makes. I always loved the character. I wish somebody would do something like that.
Bad writing has
He's an
killed more characters.
He's an extraordinary character, and it's one that really I don't think has any limits. And you could do so many different things with him. You know, it's a thing. The ones that got me when I was a kid was when he was in Adventure Comics, and I think it was Jim O'Paro, I believe, was drawing it. I forget who the writer was. It's hard to say. And those were just really hard, real life kind of gritty crime stories. And he was just kind of an avenger in that. That's where I think he works best.
Yeah, but like I said, it just unfortunately it just like it closes. It seems to close off his storyline.
Yeah. Alan Moore did a great thing with him in Swamp Thing, where he made him a much more cosmic kind of character that, again, you're going to run into a roadblock with that later, because there's only so much you can do with a character that can blow out the sun by listening hard, so
Yeah.
you have to be careful with that. But it was a great way to take it. It shows you can take many different directions with it.
You get the Dragon Ball Z problem. Or just get bigger and bigger. We're destroying universes now.
Yeah.
No conflict is working.
Question about DC characters, probably some people will know to remember him. Is Enemy Ace. I loved him. I love that guy. Of course, Tony Kubert's artwork was about 90% of it.
Right.
And it was also the old Batman. They had the Batman thing where it was always dark.
Well, my brothers were, my older brothers were both big comic book readers when I was a kid. We had stacks all over the house all the time. So I got some of the like old Silver Age stuff from them. And other characters that I liked was the Metal Man and Metamorpho and Ultra the Multi-Alien. Yeah, it was a mystery in space. They had a whole series in that. And bizarre character. You know, this guy who had been injured in space and had been operated on by these different aliens. He was parts of all kinds of different aliens that had different powers.
Just Frankenstein
You know,
again.
yeah, he was, I mean, bizarre looking. He was like green on one side with long hair and kind of steely silver on another. He had a bird leg and he had a lightning leg. It was strange.
Chimera.
And then the original Arnold Drake Doom Patrol, I loved as a kid, which is probably actually my favorite superhero comic because it's so bizarre. It's just so weird. It's kind of this almost, I think, what the term superhero almost should be, really, when you start looking at stuff. It's just so strange. There's not a lot of other characters, though, that I would be interested in. I don't think I'm cool enough anymore to Marvel or DC to want to hire me.
Shut up.
You know, I've done that in the day, and I'm fine with that. I'm okay. I got to do what I did. You know, that's fine. But yeah, I think that guys like me are kind of considered old school, and they don't really, you know, we haven't much new to offer anymore, sadly. But oh well, it's okay. Do my own stuff.
Boo. Boo. You shut up. I'm gonna tell Leah that you're self-deprecating.
Well, I mean, it's just after a while you have to kind of realize that Mike Barron and I were talking about this at LibertyCon, and he was kind of saying the same thing. Although Mike is one of the greatest comic book writers of all time, in my opinion, and he's the one who, of course, I kind of learned of it through his comic Nexus with Steve Rude, but he did some amazing things with the Flash that's still being used today. It was his idea that the Flash had to eat a whole lot in order to keep just moving around because he burned up so many calories.
That makes sense.
So that was Mike's idea. He told me that was just a throwaway idea he had, when he was writing. But he kind of said the same thing. He said, they look at guys like us and they think we don't have brains anymore. I said, well, I don't know what kind of brains I have, but I have a decent
I
brain.
mean, you got a head.
Yeah, that's something in it.
It's a
that
good
rounds
dome
around.
right there.
But yeah, and I just think that the characters have changed so much, they don't hold a whole lot of allure for me anymore. If I had to write Superman, say Zack Snyder kind of way, I just wouldn't be interested in it. Just that's not the character. Call it something else, that's okay. But it just wouldn't interest me. Just like I wouldn't be too interested in writing an Adam West Batman kind of thing. Although I loved it. I loved it as a kid, and it was really kind of what got me into comics. But that's not the way I see Batman, and so it wouldn't interest me.
The trauma-less Batman. Yeah, my parents better, but
Yeah.
let's boogie, go dance
Well,
instead.
one of the attractive things about Popeye, when he offered it to me, was I was given a whole lot of creative freedom in where to take it. And I said, well, what if I do it exactly as if E.C. Seeger, who created Popeye, was doing it? Make it look exactly like that. And they liked that idea, but it didn't seem like that they weren't blown away by it. But they were kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so my friend Terry Beatty, who did the art, he not only did the art, he did the coloring, he hand lettered it to look exactly like the old strips. And that's why I think it was so successful, because it looked just like a real Popeye comic. Martians notwithstanding, there they were. But that's why it was so fun to me too, because it's like, wow, I'm writing a real Popeye. It looks just like him. And so that's one of the reasons. But I remember some years ago, there was a Popeye comic that somebody had done, where they had tried to make him kind of look like a manga figure, almost. And it was kind of a cool design, but I was kind of like, that just does not seem like Popeye to me. It seems like somebody else, which is fine. But
digression. Do you know that Popeye is the most famous comic, like the most popular comics in India?
In India.
In India.
Okay.
Oh, they love Popeye.
I didn't know that. I have friends in
They
India.
read
I should let them know.
a lot of areas of India, they read it like we would read Superman comics.
Oh. Well, I know I have some Australian friends, and the Phantom, Lee Fawkes, the Phantom, the guy in the purple suit, is enormously huge down there. And to the point where they said you go into like what we would consider convenience store here, and there's like phantom trading cards, a little machine, a little gumball machine that's phantom rings and stuff. And he's just everywhere, and the rest of the world doesn't know who he is.
Tintin is also like
Yeah.
very, very famous in India and throughout South Asia. Like, oh my God,
So
Tintin.
it's, we live in kind of a little microcosm sometimes.
We forget that the world isn't America, and there's someone out there, kid, going like, I want to be Tintin and explore the world, and not be Superman. Exists. We have 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes left. Is it open for question and comment? Do it.
Whatever you want to ask.
Well, you're kind of, we're just a subculture of the literary world. I always wondered, who are the Shakespeares of these other cultures that we never get to hear about?
And I always worry about who was the Shakespeares that never got a chance,
Yeah.
you know?
And that's a very real thing. I know in my time, I've had a lot of friends who are, writers and artists too, but I could think of at least 3 right now, writers. A couple of them are no longer with us, but one still is, that are as good or better than anybody I've ever known. And yet, nobody knows who they are, and they just haven't been successful, just out of, bad luck, really, more than anything else. Because really, when you boil it down, it's all about luck. It's really all about being in the right place at the right time. You can't plan it, you can't, you just, but if you keep on trying, eventually the lightning will hit you, I think.
Yeah.
But you have to be there when it does. You can't just think, oh, here I am, you have to be doing the job. Even though sometimes it seems like it's an empty thing. I wrote for 5 years. I wrote a short story a week for 5 years and sent it off out of Ray Bradbury's advice to me. I knew Ray back at the time. And he suggested to do that. He said, every week write yourself a short story. He said, don't even worry about the quality at first, just get it done. And he said, and then send it off somewhere. He said, act like you really, you know what you're doing. Send it off somewhere, see if they'll publish it. He said, and at the end of a year, you'll have 52 short stories, and he says it's impossible for all of them to be bad.
They can't all be shared.
Yeah.
Sean, was it Larry Niven said, start by writing short stories, get your mistakes over with in a hurry?
Yeah,
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
Also, I like the knit your wings while you're falling.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did that work out for you? You said you did that for several years. How did that work out for you?
It was very grueling. I was going to school, college too at the time. And I have to say that in a moment of self-pity, that I had absolutely nobody supporting me on that except for Ray. But that was enough.
How about the side?
When Ray Bradbury said that,
You should carry this.
And so, to hell with everybody else, I thought, so I went ahead and did it. It all happened very, I got so many rejection slips that I kept them in a binder. And then later on, after I became more established, when people would write to me and, I want to be a writer and so forth, fan letters and so forth, I would answer the backs of my rejection letters. So, hopefully that helped somebody too. But what ended up happening is I was in a creative writing class in college. The teacher came in one day and he said, okay, this is the assignment for today. You write a short story that's nothing but dialogue, no narrative, just 2 characters talking. A complete story by 20 minutes. Yeah, so that's what we did. And I couldn't think of anything other than a guy talking to his dead wife at her grave. And I thought, well, he said dialogue, though, not monologue. So she talks back.
Nice.
And not my greatest hour, but I did what I could.
Well, you only got 20 minutes, too.
Yeah. Well, he flunked me on it
Oh.
because he said that couldn't happen. That's unrealistic. He said, you think you're Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe? You're not.
Oh, whatever's great.
Oh, you're Martin Howell.
And again, I didn't think it was my greatest hour by any means, but I didn't think it deserved that.
Right.
And so I was corresponding with an artist friend of mine at the time in Ireland, and I just happened to send her the story and just said, do you think this is really that awful? Holy shit.
Yeah.
And I heard nothing more about that from her. She just ignored it. I thought it must be bad.
Right.
And then about a year later, I get this envelope from Australia and open it up, and there's this magazine called Fantastique. that was very controversial and kind of turned out to be sort of illegal, and the government shut it down. It was this really like overblown horror magazine. And I was going, why? And I opened it up and a check fell out of it. And it was a $200 check, and I was like, what in the hell is going on? And so I looked in the table of contents real quick, and there was my name. And she had illustrated the story as like a 3-page comic book story. And it was the first, and I wasn't trying to get into comics at the time.
That's a nice amount of money for what that is.
It really was. It might as well have been 200,000 the way I felt.
Wow.
And I remember thinking like, wow, maybe I should try to do this again. And the next comic book story I wrote, which was for a horror anthology, it sold. And then it just kept on going. And so I got into it a different way than I originally, because originally I wanted to be a prose writer, I'm being honest.
And I would say like that, like going dialogue only is a really good idea. I was in a mentorship with Mary Robinette Cowell, and that was the first exercise she made me do. It helped.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Makes you think hard.
It does make you
The
think.
how to distinguish character without saying who they are.
Yeah.
Do it. Like,
So-
better writers
So
do
it worked out good for me.
Yeah, he's great.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah, it worked out well for me. Again, I think that was another situation of just pure luck, though. Being, I had, if he hadn't discouraged me, I doubt I would have sent that to her. And that she wouldn't have illustrated it, nobody would have known, and maybe I still would be typing a story a week and sending them off and getting rejection slips, I don't know. It just depends, because really, just because you might happen to become really good one day, doesn't mean it's gonna work for you unless you're in the right place.
Right.
It just doesn't. And how many of us, have read stories or seen movies that weren't very good, but are very successful?
Oh, yeah.
That happens.
Every
So
little
it's the
kid is
opposite.
like, I can do better than that. I love when kids read that, I'm like, I could do better than that. Mom, you suck.
One of my first experiences at a convention, when I was just shortly after I first got published, this guy came up and he was looking at my stuff, and he just kind of went, So, do you draw all of this? And I said, no. I said, I wrote them. Oh, you mean you printed these little words in the bubbles? And I said, no, a letterer did that. He said, well, then what'd you do? I said, well, I wrote the story. Everything that you see that happens in stories because I said it. Said it was supposed to be there. He said, hell, I could do that. I said,
Go do it.
go ahead. Go on. You probably can. Go ahead.
And we are out of time. I can see the next people are filing in.
Yeah.
I would like you sit down. You're supposed to say who you are and how to find you and where to find you within this con.
Well, you can find me here for the rest of the weekend.
And you are Martin Powell.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. The best place to find my books, if you're interested, is I have an Amazon authors page that has most of my stuff on there. I have like 30 kids' books in particular that are always there, and I keep those in print. But my other stuff too, it's probably about 100 books altogether.
He's in the dealer's room. And I am Michelle, I'm associate editor of Pseudopod, and my art is in the art room, my giant Godzilla. I would like a Best in Show if you want to go vote, I'm just saying. And that's it.
Godzilla.